At my parents' celebration dinner, in front of relatives and business partners, my mother laughed and called me the family's leftover. My father didn't correct her. He smiled into his wine glass and added, "Every family has that 5% you just learn to live with." I remember the sound of a few people chuckling because they thought it was harmless. I remember staring at the tablecloth so I wouldn't have to see who agreed. My name is Elena Morgan. I'm 27. That night, something inside me snapped, and I never went back the same. The dining room was buzzing with polite conversation, the clinking of glasses, and the low hum of background music that tried too hard to be elegant. Business partners leaned toward each other, commenting softly on my father's latest contract, a multi-million-dollar deal he'd just closed. He stood at the head of the table, chest puffed, hand occasionally brushing over the polished surface, announcing in that measured, practiced tone that made everyone nod like they were in on some secret. This deal would put the company on the map for the next decade. The room reacted with smiles, small murmurs of approval, even the subtle leaning in that meant, "I see you, I respect this success." Then came the spotlight on Ethan. My older brother, all grin and braces, sat a little too straight, practically glowing with pride as my parents reminded everyone that he had been accepted to one of the most elite prep schools in the region. Toasts were made, glasses lifted, laughter sprinkled in like seasoning. It was meant to be celebratory, a family in harmony, or at least that's what everyone at the table was supposed to believe. And then my mother laughed. It wasn't the light, inclusive laugh that signals joy. It was sharp-edged, carrying the echo of a long-held judgment. "And then there's Elena," she said, almost as an aside, "the one that never quite fits." Her tone was playful if you squinted at it the right way, but the edges cut clean. Heads turned. Some partners smiled politely, unsure if it was a joke. My father, rather than softening the blow, smiled into his wine glass and added that line I'd heard him repeat before, now sharpened by the room. "Every family has that 5% you just learn to live with." The words were meant to be casual, social banter, a light-hearted acknowledgement of what they'd framed as my perpetual otherness. But the effect was surgical. Laughter punctuated the sentence, small, polite, a few stifled snickers from relatives who wanted to keep the room from freezing. I could feel the table's attention flickering toward me, the subtle shifts in posture, the quiet assessment of someone who had just been publicly filed under disposable. It wasn't new, this pattern, but the timing, the way it landed after a celebration of success and achievement, was like stepping into a cold room barefoot. I remember my fork trembling slightly in my hand, the polished wood of the table pressed under my knuckles as I gripped it tighter than necessary. I stared down at my plate, at the spiral pattern in the porcelain, willing my pulse to calm, trying not to let my hands give me away. I remember the way my chest tightened, the shallow inhale I didn't dare turn into a breath. Around me, voices carried on, glasses clinked, the room didn't pause, my humiliation had to be invisible, a shadow the rest could ignore. And then something inside me snapped. Not with noise, not with dramatic speech, not with a slam of a chair or a shouted protest. It was quieter than that. It was a rupture deep in the center of me, a silent acknowledgement that this would not be contained anymore. That table, those smiles, the careful performances, they were theirs, not mine. I could feel a line being drawn, a boundary forming where there had been none. The sense of being othered finally had a tangible shape. It wasn't just a feeling, it was a decision to leave it behind. I went upstairs and opened the small closet where I kept my things I actually cared about. A few worn hoodies, a couple of sketchbooks, my notebooks filled with half-drawn designs, and the backpack that had been mine since middle school. I shoved in what I could carry, everything else could wait or didn't matter. The room smelled faintly of fabric softener and lemon cleaner, the kind my mom used obsessively, and I inhaled it anyway, as if to memorize the air one last time. I emptied my savings jar onto the bed, 63 crumpled dollars. I counted them twice, then 3 times, stacking the bills neatly, pressing them flat against the palm of my hand. That small pile felt impossibly heavy, like the weight of every expectation I'd ever failed to meet, every glance that said not quite enough, every word that lingered in the echo of that dinner. Yet it was all I had, and suddenly it was enough. On the kitchen counter, I left my house key where it was supposed to be, like I had no intention of returning, yet like the gesture might soften the blow. I didn't pack a note. I didn't leave a warning. They would assume, of course, that I'd be back before sunrise, that this was just teenage defiance, that I would tire of the city streets and the uncertainty and the lack of a safety net. My parents always assumed I'd follow the invisible leash that tied me to their world, their approval, their carefully constructed image. I stepped outside, my backpack slung over one shoulder, the evening air catching my hair and sticking to the sweat along my neck. My chest tightened with fear, a dull ache that I tried to mask under a forced, casual stride. Each step down the driveway felt like I was moving away from a part of myself, but also toward something I couldn't yet define, a space where the judgment, the sneering laughter, the 5% label wouldn't follow. At the bus station, I bought a one-way ticket to Austin. The city name felt foreign and big and scary written in black ink on the paper slip. I clutched it like a talisman, refusing to look at the time ticking away on the station clock, refusing to watch the doors close on my past. When my phone vibrated, it was my parents'. Texts filled with disbelief, predictions that I'd fail, veiled warnings wrapped in concern. I didn't reply. I couldn't, not yet. Fear and stubbornness warred in me. I was terrified, heart hammering, palms clammy against the straps of my backpack, imagining the nights I might sleep on unfamiliar sidewalks, the strange faces I'd navigate, the uncertainty of work and food and safety. But alongside it, there was a stubborn fire that wouldn't be extinguished. The certainty that I had to leave, that staying meant being swallowed whole by their opinions, their image, their version of me. As the bus pulled away from the station, the city lights blurring past like streaks of memory, I pressed my forehead to the window and felt a quiet, almost imperceptible shift inside me. I was gone. And for the first time, I realized that the world, messy and unknown and frightening, was entirely mine to step into. Austin hit me like a wave, warm, chaotic, and impossibly alive. The first few nights I slept in a cheap motel, but by the end of the week, I'd found work at a small cafe owned by Marisol, a woman whose hands were always dusted with flour, and whose voice carried the kind of patience I didn't know I could rely on. She didn't ask questions about why I'd arrived with nothing but a backpack and a handful of crumpled bills. She just handed me an apron and showed me how to pull espresso shots without splashing the counter, how to memorize the complex orders of regulars, how to keep my hands moving even when the morning rush felt like it might swallow me whole. Jonah was already there, a line cook with a permanent smudge of something on his forearm and a grin that made you feel like he'd been through every mistake in the world and come out on the other side laughing. He took it upon himself to look out for me in ways I didn't even realize I needed. When a customer barked orders with thinly veiled contempt, Jonah would step in with a joke or a quiet correction that made me feel shielded without explaining why. His presence was constant, sometimes annoyingly so, but it was a stability I had never had at home. He became the older sibling I'd never had, offering guidance and protection, and I clung to it without realizing how much I'd been starved for it. The work was relentless. Double shifts became normal, the hours stretching long into nights where the cafe emptied, lights dimmed, and the city hummed beyond the windows. I learned to move quickly, to memorize drink combinations and orders, to anticipate needs before they were spoken. Each task I completed felt like a small victory. Each tip tucked into my pocket was a quiet reinforcement that I could make it on my own. In the gaps between orders, I pulled out my cheap spiral notebook and sketched. Lines flowed over pages, jackets with sharp shoulders, dresses with hidden seams, designs I had never dared to show anyone. This was mine, purely mine. The cafe smelled like roasted coffee and toasted bread, the air warm and slightly sweet, and I let myself imagine a future in which I belonged somewhere, anywhere, without needing approval from people whose smiles had once cut so deep. Those sketches became more than habit, they became identity. Every curve of fabric I drew was a reminder that I existed outside the constraints of judgment, outside the family that had labeled me disposable. When I looked at those pages, I could feel the first flickers of confidence, small but stubborn, growing where fear and shame had once dominated. It was thrilling and terrifying all at once. Evenings were quiet after the last customer left, Jonah wiping down the counters while Marisol counted the day's receipts. I would sit at a corner table, notebook open, pencil scratching across pages that were mine alone, and for the first time in memory, I could breathe without calculating how every move might be received by the people who had spent years defining me as less than. In that small cafe, with its chaotic rhythm and unpretentious light, I began to feel like I belonged to someone other than my family, belonged to myself. By the end of my first year working at the cafe, I had scraped together enough hours and recommendations to apply to the local community college's fashion program. Acceptance came with grants and need-based aid, letters stamped with the promise that I didn't have to carry this on my own, at least not entirely. Holding that envelope in my hands for the first time, I felt a tremor of something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years: independence. Not just from my parents, but from the idea that my worth had to be negotiated, measured, or justified to anyone else. For the first time, my future felt like a territory I could claim, rather than a hallway where I was always trailing behind someone else. Classes began, and I found myself in a studio flooded with sunlight and mannequins, the smell of fabric and pins in the air, the faint hum of sewing machines in the background. I loved the sound, the rhythm, the control. I had space here, space to explore shapes, textures, the way clothing could express a person without apology. And then came Dr. Patel. She wasn't the kind to offer soft encouragement. Her gaze was sharp, the kind that pinned you to your choices and forced you to confront what you weren't saying as much as what you were. I remember one critique session in particular. I had spread out my sketches, my designs carefully rendered but cautious, lines muted, color choices safe. She picked up a piece, held it between her fingers, and looked me in the eye. "Elena," she said, and her voice was steady, almost gentle but with a weight that made the room hush, "you're apologizing for taking up space." Her words landed like a cold splash of water. I stammered, tried to explain my choices, soft fabrics, hidden seams, muted colors, but she cut me off with a shake of her head. "You're hiding, not designing," she said. "You've been conditioned to make yourself small. I want to see you claim your presence on every line of that fabric." It stung, but it also pierced something deeper. For so long, I had folded myself into corners, shrunk to fit the expectations of my parents, to avoid being the target of ridicule or dismissal. Dr. Patel's words weren't just critique, they were a challenge, a mirror held up to every internalized judgment I'd carried since that night at the dinner table. I felt an internal shift begin, subtle at first, a trembling recognition that I had been quietly apologizing for existing, for taking up room, for being visible. After class, I sat alone at a corner table with my notebook, the pencil hovering over paper. I stared at the half-finished designs, the lines I had drawn cautiously, and for the first time consciously erased the self-limiting edits. I thought of my parents' laughter, the 5%, the long shadow of being the family's afterthought, and I felt a quiet determination that whatever I created next would be unapologetically mine. I began sketching bolder lines, sharper angles, more daring combinations. Every stroke felt like staking territory, every pattern a declaration that I was no longer invisible, no longer bending to someone else's measure of me. By the time I left the studio that evening, the air was cooler outside, but inside me something had shifted. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was claiming, defining, and building a version of myself that no one could dismiss with a laugh. The small, cautious girl who had left home months ago was still there, but she was learning to stand taller, to occupy space without apology, to let her designs and herself be seen. The citywide student showcase was announced months in advance, plastered across campus bulletin boards, emails, and whispered excitement in classrooms. The theme was resilience, how individuals overcame obstacles, adapted, and transformed personal struggle into expression. From the moment I read it, I knew I had to enter. My sketches shifted from cautious experimentation to something raw, personal, and almost confrontational. Every piece in the collection would carry the weight of being labeled the extra piece, the one meant to be overlooked, forgotten, or minimized. I worked late nights in my tiny studio apartment, sewing under the harsh glow of a single desk lamp, the whir of a borrowed sewing machine a steady companion. Exposed seams ran across jackets like scars made beautiful. Dresses were lined with stitched phrases only the wearer could see. "I am enough, not disposable. I belong here." One black blazer, my centerpiece, had a small tag sewn inside the collar, "Not disposable." I held my breath each time I pinned and stitched, knowing the meaning would be invisible to most, but utterly powerful to me. Every decision felt like a gamble. Showcasing vulnerability, layered into fabric and thread, was terrifying. I imagined the students, professors, and visitors examining each piece, thinking it was just clothing, unaware of the personal declaration woven into it. What if they laughed, dismissed it as amateur? I had been conditioned for years to shrink, and now I was stretching into something larger than I'd ever allowed myself to be. Every seam was a risk, every phrase a defiance. On the day of the showcase, the gallery smelled faintly of fabric softener, new leather, and the faint metallic tang of pins and scissors. Models lined up backstage, nerves buzzing, garments draped over their shoulders like armor. I hovered behind them, clipboard in hand, heart hammering, not from doubt about the technical quality, but because every stitch felt like an unspoken confrontation with my past. The audience arrived in waves: classmates, local designers, professors, and a smattering of community members curious about the theme. The lights dimmed, music swelled, and one by one the models walked. My collection moved with them, the exposed seams catching the soft lights, the hidden messages only discovered when sleeves were lifted or collars peeked at. Whispers circled the room. Some professors nodded slowly, others exchanged impressed glances. I caught Dr. Patel's eye in the front row. Her small, approving nod made my chest tighten with relief and something more, a quiet pride. When the black blazer passed down the runway, the inside collar hidden until the model tilted her head, the phrase "not disposable" flashed briefly. A ripple passed through the audience, some murmured, some paused to examine the next garment more carefully. That tiny phrase, meant only for the wearer but now witnessed by others, felt like a declaration. I existed. I mattered. I was not invisible. By the end of the showcase, applause filled the gallery, warm and sincere. The collection had been risky, deeply personal, and it had landed. I felt it, somewhere in the hollow between my ribs and my stomach, a first recognition that I could create something unapologetically mine and have it seen, respected, even celebrated. In that moment, the designs were no longer just fabric and thread. They were me, claiming space, refusing to shrink, refusing to be overlooked ever again. It was a late Thursday evening when my phone rang, Caleb's name flashing across the screen. My younger brother's voice had changed since I last heard it, smaller, almost fragile, like it had been squeezed through a narrow funnel of worry and fear. "Elena," he said, pausing as if choosing words carefully, "Mom and Dad, it's bad. The company, it's gone. The contracts, the clients, all gone. They've lost almost everything." I felt the words settle in my chest like a slow, heavy rain. I listened as he explained, stumbling over phrases about reckless investments, loans that had spiraled, and creditors calling day after day. Their company, the one they'd paraded like a badge of prestige at every social gathering, had folded. And worse, the bank had begun foreclosure proceedings on the house where I had grown up, the house that had always been a silent witness to their favoritism, their judgment, their casual dismissal of me. Caleb's voice cracked as he spoke, and I could hear the unease in the background, the muffled arguing, the soft clatter of things being packed or moved, the tension of people who had long believed their position unassailable finally facing reality. They want to talk to you," he said. "They said they're asking for you. They said you're the one people respect now. The one people notice, the one who actually has something going for her." I closed my eyes and felt the bitter irony twist in my gut. The parents who had made a spectacle of my supposed inferiority, who had laughed at me in front of family and business partners, were now coming to me, the daughter they had deemed disposable, invisible, the one every family learns to live with. Their desperation was a sharp contrast to the casual cruelty I had endured for years, and for a moment, I let myself just feel it. The mix of disbelief, vindication, and lingering resentment churned inside me like a storm. I thought of that dinner so long ago, of my mother's laughter and my father's smug delivery of the 5% line, of every calculated glance, every diminishing word. And now, the tables had turned, not dramatically, not in some cinematic collapse, but in a quiet, steady unraveling that left them seeking the very approval they had denied me. It was subtle, but it carried weight, the kind that only comes from seeing someone once dismissed become the person everyone else actually respects. I thanked Caleb, his voice trembling still, and promised I would call back. As I hung up, the apartment felt unusually still, the hum of the city outside muted somehow. I ran my hand over the cover of my notebook, the sketches inside reminding me of how far I'd come, of the life I'd begun to build separate from them. Their collapse wasn't a victory I sought, it was a consequence of their choices, but the timing, the irony, the shift in power was impossible to ignore. For the first time in years, I didn't feel the familiar pull of inadequacy. Instead, I felt a cold, precise clarity. Their reckoning would not dictate my path. It was theirs to face. And in that moment, I understood the power of being the one who no longer needed anyone else's approval to matter. A week after Caleb's call, a friend from college sent me a link. A clip from that long-ago dinner had resurfaced online. I clicked, half expecting the embarrassment to have faded, half dreading the same humiliation I once carried silently. But there I was, 16 again, frozen in my seat while my mother laughed and called me the leftover, my father's smug voice adding, "Every family has that 5% you just learn to live with." The room was filled with relatives and business partners, all visible witnesses to the casual cruelty that had once defined my adolescence. The comments beneath the video were immediate and sharp. Strangers called out the humiliation, dissecting every sneer and chuckle. "This is awful," one user wrote. "How can they treat their own child like this?" Another commented, "You can literally see her shrinking in the chair. That's heartbreaking." People were outraged, yes, but also sympathetic, sending virtual nods, messages of support, and hashtags about toxic parenting. The clip spread fast, shared by more than a few local news outlets and bloggers who framed it as a cautionary story of parental entitlement and public humiliation. I scrolled through the reactions, heart-pounding, not because I was embarrassed, but because something else was happening. My parents' carefully curated image, the one they had spent years constructing with charm, smiles, and social appearances, was cracking. Every viral share chipped away at the polished veneer they relied on to maintain influence and respect. I felt a quiet, measured sense of irony wash over me. The power dynamic had shifted in a subtle but undeniable way. The people who once nodded politely at their jokes and dismissals were now publicly questioning it, labeling it, and calling them to account. For the first time, I saw my parents not as untouchable figures, but as ordinary humans exposed to scrutiny, their reputation no longer able to shield them from consequence. I thought of my designs, my showcase, my struggle to claim space in the world, and realized that the universe had a way of highlighting truths long after they had been buried. The video wasn't just a reminder of old wounds. It was evidence, witnessed and recognized by others, that the narrative I had been forced to endure could no longer go unchallenged. I leaned back in my chair, taking it in. The outrage online was measured, insistent, and persistent. Strangers were holding them accountable in a way I never could have imagined at 16. Their laughter, their casual diminishment, their 5% line, it was all now public. I could feel the shift, the first real sign that social power had begun to tilt. And for once, I didn't feel powerless. I didn't post, comment, or react. I didn't need to. The world had already witnessed what had been done to me, and the echo was strong enough on its own. In that quiet recognition, I felt a strange mixture of vindication and detachment. My past was finally visible, and my parents' control over it was slipping through their fingers. I pulled up to the house one late afternoon, the sun hanging low and golden over the street, casting long shadows across cracked sidewalks. The place looked smaller somehow, worn around the edges, the paint faded, a few shingles missing, the lawn patchy in ways it hadn't been when I left. The grandeur my parents had always cultivated felt gone, replaced by a quiet, unassuming tiredness. I parked slowly, heart steady but alert, as if preparing to read a room I hadn't been in for years. Inside, the air smelled faintly of dust and old wood, mingled with the sharp tang of cleaning products that hadn't quite erased the weight of neglect. My parents were older, visibly. My mother's hands shook slightly as she poured tea, her posture stiff, shoulders slumped. My father's hair had grayed at the temples, his eyes carrying a fatigue that wasn't just physical. It was a careful kind of worry, the sort that accumulates when consequences are long overdue. They greeted me quietly, almost cautiously, as if unsure whether the daughter they once dismissed would arrive with anger, mockery, or something else entirely. I followed them to the living room, where bills and statements were spread across the coffee table. My eyes caught something my stomach sank at. The education fund they had assured me was safe, the money supposedly earmarked for my future, was gone, quietly drained over the years to cover business losses while they maintained appearances. My mother's attempt at justification was immediate, stumbling over excuses about unforeseen expenses, saving the company, making sure the family survived. My father nodded, muttering something about responsibility and priorities, as though their decisions, however self-serving, should be met with understanding. I listened to them explain, but I didn't flinch, I didn't yell, I didn't cry. There was an expectation in the room, unspoken but palpable. They assumed I would step in, offer help, rescue them from the consequences of their choices. And for a brief moment, I allowed myself to note the absurdity of it. The same people who once treated me as an afterthought now looked to me as the solution, the stabilizing force. Their eyes searched mine, waiting for permission, for empathy, for compliance. But I stayed calm, deliberately, holding myself in check. My hands rested on the back of a chair, fingers tightening slightly as I measured my next move. I felt the familiar pull of history, years of training myself to accommodate, to apologize, to take up as little space as possible. But I resisted it. I was not the scared, shrinking child who had left this house years ago. I was someone who had built a life outside their control, who had claimed her own identity, and who understood clearly that their crisis did not automatically entitle them to my compliance. I let them speak, let their voices fill the room with defensiveness and rationalization, and through it all I simply observed. Each excuse, each soft plea, each tired sigh reinforced what I already knew. They expected the world to bend to them as it had for so long, and this time I was not part of that world. My emotional containment was deliberate, a quiet assertion that power dynamics had shifted. I would listen, I would process, but I would not be moved by old patterns. The room felt smaller than it should have, the house diminished in more ways than one. And in that space, I realized, fully, without doubt, that my parents' expectations no longer held sway over me. I laid everything out clearly, deliberately, letting each word land in the quiet room like measured instructions. If I'm stepping in, I said, keeping my tone even, these are the conditions. You sell the remaining luxury items, cars, jewelry, anything that isn't essential. You downsize immediately. You both get regular jobs, no exceptions, no delays, and you will issue a public apology that names what happened. Not vague, not evasive. Something like, we acknowledge that we treated our daughter unfairly, diminished her publicly, and mismanaged funds intended for her future. We apologize for our actions and their impact. Their faces stiffened instantly. My mother's hands gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white, while my father's jaw clenched. I continued, watching their reactions carefully. You will also begin therapy together and individually, and this financial support is structured. It is temporary, not a restoration of your previous lifestyle, not a buyback of status, and not an automatic path to forgiveness. I paused, letting it sink in, watching pride and resistance struggle visibly to remain intact behind their eyes. A week later, we sat across from my lawyer, a quiet room filled with the low hum of fluorescent lights and the scratch of pen on paper. The agreement was formal, precise, an airtight document spelling out every term, every expectation, every accountability measure. I could feel the weight in the room, the shift from past dynamics to a new, unambiguous reality. My parents read each clause slowly. I noticed the subtle telltales, my father's brow furrowed, lips tightening, an internal debate playing across his face between indignation and the undeniable logic before him. My mother's fingers drummed lightly against the table, as though trying to summon courage, while her eyes flickered toward mine, a silent plea for leniency that I didn't grant. When it came time to sign, they did so, almost mechanically. Their pens scratched across the paper, each signature an acknowledgement they could not verbally refuse. I saw the brief flicker of something human, resistance swallowed, pride tamped down, the uncomfortable recognition that for the first time in decades, their daughter held the authority. They were agreeing to terms that stripped away the illusions they had built, the power they had taken for granted, the narrative they had long controlled. Even as they signed, I remained composed. I didn't gloat, I didn't smile triumphantly. I simply observed, internalizing the finality of the moment. This was not revenge for spectacle, it was accountability, executed cleanly, firmly, without theatrics. Every clause they agreed to reinforce the shift that had been quietly building over the past years. The power no longer resided with them. I had reclaimed it. Their internal reactions were layered, visible if subtle. My father's lips pressed thin, the edge of indignation still lingering but subdued by reality. My mother's shoulders straightened, a mixture of relief and resignation etched across her face. The quiet room held that tension, a mix of completion and the discomfort of forced recognition. And in that charged stillness, I realized, fully and without doubt, that the balance had irrevocably changed. The agreement was signed, the terms were set, and I walked away knowing that for the first time, I would engage on my terms, not theirs. By the time the foreclosure was finalized, the house, the one that had felt cavernous and suffocating when I was 16, looked smaller, worn, its edges softened by time and neglect. My parents had moved into a modest rental, the kind of apartment where everything was functional, nothing luxurious. I arranged structured financial support for their immediate needs, making it clear it wasn't a handout or an obligation to restore their former life. The public apology they issued circulated widely, just as the resurfaced dinner clip had, and I watched as the same audience that had once seen them hold all the power now witnessed them humbled, accountable, and unmistakably human. Meanwhile, my citywide showcase placement, third place, opened doors I hadn't dared to imagine. With Jonah, who had become my unwavering support since Austin, and Lena, a friend and fellow designer from school, we launched a small label. Our designs leaned into the resilience I had built from being labeled the extra piece, blending empowerment with accessibility. It was thrilling and terrifying to stake my claim in a space that had once felt so far from me, but I thrived in it, finally confident in the voice that had always been mine. When my childhood home went to auction, I bought it. I didn't move back in. That house would never be the place of quiet intimidation again. Instead, I converted it into the Unwritten Project, a nonprofit studio offering sewing workshops, mentorship, and small grants to teenagers who had been told they were problems, burdens, or disappointments. Every wall, every light fixture, every table in that space now carried the energy of possibility instead of judgment. I felt it in my chest every time a young person left the studio with a small spark of pride, carrying a piece of their own story into the world. My parents have visited once or twice, and the relationship is civil but altered. I make it clear, I have outgrown the version of myself that needed their approval. Forgiveness, if it comes, will be on my terms, not theirs. And that realization, the one that had taken years of careful work, courage, and reclamation, feels heavier and more potent than any revenge I might have imagined. For me, the victory isn't in watching them fall. It's in the life I've built where their opinion no longer defines my worth, where their past attempts to diminish me can't touch the person I've become. I've learned that the real power isn't in retaliation, it's in refusing to stay the person they tried to define. That truth hums in every seam I stitch, every design I present, every teen who walks out of the Unwritten Project a little taller than they came in. If you've been drawn in by this story, like and subscribe for more, and check out another story in the description. You won't want to miss it.